A 13-year-old black boy, often lost in thought during class, is suddenly called out by his teacher. He's forced to stand and face a math equation far beyond his grade level. His classmates, some laughing, others skeptical, watch him with doubt. What they don't know is that the boy standing at the board is a hidden math prodigy. The midday sun casts warm streaks of light across the linoleum floors of Riverside Middle School. It's early autumn in Atlanta, Georgia, and the classroom hums with the low murmur of students chatting and chairs scraping against the floor. Room 3002 is no exception. The buzz of adolescent energy fills the space as students file in for their 8th grade math class. At the back of the room, near the window, Jamal Carter, a quiet black boy, settles into his usual seat. The 13-year-old has a presence that allows him to blend into the background. His brown eyes, sharp yet often distant, wander toward the world outside. As he places his notebook on the desk, his posture is relaxed, almost too much so. One arm resting on the desk, the other propping up his chin. The scene outside the window, a few trees swaying gently in the breeze, a bird hopping along the fence, seems far more captivating than the bustling classroom around him. Jamal isn't inattentive by choice. He has a sharp mind, one that often works faster than the pace of the classroom lessons. Numbers and equations fascinate him, but the repetitive drills and slow progress of his math class feel uninspiring. Instead of raising his hand or engaging, he lets his mind drift, finding solace in the steady rhythm of the world outside. Though his notebook is mostly blank on the assigned pages, the margins are filled with advanced equations and solutions he scribbled during his free time, puzzles he's challenged himself to solve. At the front of the room, Mrs. Amanda Thompson stands with her arms crossed, surveying the class as they take their seats. A no-nonsense teacher with years of experience, Mrs. Thompson is known for her sharp tongue and high expectations. Her tailored blazer and neatly styled hair only add to her aura of authority. She takes pride in spotting potential in her students and isn't afraid to push them when she thinks they aren't meeting their full capabilities. Today, however, her patience is wearing thin. The results of the most recent math tests lie in a neat stack on her desk. While a few students performed well, the majority struggled. Mrs. Thompson doesn't tolerate mediocrity, and the sight of so many low scores leaves her questioning whether her students are putting in the effort she demands. She picks up the stack of papers and begins calling names, handing back the tests with brief comments. "Decent work," she says to some, "and you need to study more," to others. When she reaches Jamal's desk, she hesitates for a moment. His test sits at the top of the stack, marked with a large red 100% circled at the top. It's not the first time Jamal has aced a test, but his apparent lack of interest in class frustrates her. Handing him the paper, she says nothing, her lips pressing into a thin line as she walks back to the front of the room. "All right, listen up." Mrs. Thompson's voice cuts through the chatter, silencing the room. She places the stack of tests on her desk and leans against it, her sharp gaze scanning the rows of students. "Most of you did okay," she begins, though her tone suggests otherwise, "but a lot of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks." Jamal, barely listening, rests his chin on his hand as his eyes drift back to the window. The soft rustle of leaves outside seems far more engaging than Mrs. Thompson's critique. He doesn't notice her sharp eyes flicker in his direction as she continues. "This is basic algebra," Mrs. Thompson says, her voice rising slightly. "You'll need to understand this if you want to succeed in high school, college, or anywhere else in life." She pauses, her gaze lingering on Jamal's distant expression, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Jamal Carter," she snaps, her voice cutting through the silence. Jamal jolts upright, his hand slipping from his chin as his classmates turn to look at him. His heart races and heat rushes to his cheeks. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbles, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Thompson narrows her eyes. "You seem very interested in what's going on outside," she says, nodding toward the window. "Care to share what's so fascinating?" Jamal opens his mouth to respond, but quickly shuts it again, unsure of what to say. The room fills with a few muffled chuckles, but Mrs. Thompson isn't smiling. "Let's see if you've been paying attention," she continues, her tone sharp. "Come up here." The room goes silent as Jamal stands slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His classmates watch with a mix of amusement and curiosity, some whispering under their breath. Is he going to? Is he actually going to? One student muttered. He never talks, but he doesn't even know what's going on, another added, stifling a laugh. Jamal swallowed hard, his palms sweaty as he walked to the front of the room. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him with every step, making the distance to the whiteboard feel impossibly long. Mrs. Thompson stood by the board, marker in hand, her expression unreadable. Let's see how much you've been paying attention, she said, writing an equation on the board. It was complex, far beyond what the class had covered, but not impossible for someone with Jamal's talent. She stepped back, holding the marker out to him. Go ahead, she said, her tone almost challenging. Show us what you got. Jamal took the marker, the cool plastic pressing into his hand. He stared at the equation for a moment, his mind racing. The whispers and quiet laughter behind him only made the pressure worse. His heart pounded, and for a fleeting moment, he considered handing the marker back and walking away. But something stopped him. A small voice inside reminded him of the countless hours he had spent solving problems just like this one. This wasn't about Mrs. Thompson or his classmates. It was about him and what he knew he could do. Jamal took a deep breath, raised the marker to the board, and began to write. The classroom seemed to shrink as Jamal stood in front of the whiteboard. The marker felt heavier in his hand with each passing second. His eyes darted over the equation Mrs. Thompson had written, a tangled maze of variables, exponents, and fractions. It wasn't the kind of problem most eighth graders would encounter, and it was clear she had chosen it to test him. Behind him, the class whispered and snickered, their hushed voices barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. No way he's getting that one, a boy muttered under his breath. He doesn't even know where to start, another said, laughing softly. Jamal's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he stared at the board, the problem starting to come into focus. His heart was still pounding, but now beneath the nerves, there was something else, a spark of determination. He could solve this. He just needed to focus. At her desk, Mrs. Thompson crossed her arms, watching him with a raised eyebrow. To her, this was as much a test of Jamal's focus as it was of his skill. She had always been frustrated by his lack of engagement, especially when it was clear he had potential. Now she was curious to see what he could do when put on the spot. Well, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet, we're waiting. Jamal took a deep breath and lifted the marker slowly, deliberately. His first strokes were tentative, testing the waters, but as he moved from one step to the next, his hand grew steadier. At first, the class didn't react. Some students had expected him to freeze or give up, and they were surprised when he started to solve the equation. As the numbers and symbols on the board began to connect, murmurs spread through the room. Wait, is he actually doing it? A girl in the second row whispered. Looks like it, her friend replied, leaning forward to see better. Jamal's mind moved quickly, breaking the equation into smaller pieces. He worked methodically, isolating variables, simplifying fractions, and eliminating unnecessary steps. His hand moved faster now, the squeak of the marker against the board filling the silence. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was dismantling it, breaking it down into its core components. The room grew quieter as more students realized what was happening. The whispers stopped, replaced by wide-eyed stares. Even the boy who had laughed earlier was now leaning forward, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. Behind Jamal, Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted. She had expected him to struggle, maybe even fail. But as she watched his work unfold, she felt a growing sense of astonishment. His steps were clear, precise, and correct. She stepped closer to the board, her sharp gaze scanning each line of his solution. Jamal paused briefly, double-checking his work before moving to the final steps. He could feel the weight of the class's attention now, but instead of letting it overwhelm him, he used it as fuel. He wrote the last few numbers, circled the answer, and capped the marker with a satisfying click. Stepping back, he turned to face the room. His heart was pounding, but his expression was calm. The whiteboard behind him was filled with neat lines of equations, each step building on the last, leading to the correct answer. For a moment, no one spoke. The room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound. Jamal scanned the room, catching glimpses of wide eyes and slack jaws. Even the students who usually ignored him now looked at him with something bordering on awe. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She studied the board closely, her finger tracing each line of his work. Each line of Jamal's solution was met with Mrs. Thompson's silent scrutiny. Her lips moved, checking his work as her brow furrowed slightly at one point, before smoothing out again. Finally, she turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of surprise and something else. Respect. "This is correct," she said, her voice quieter than usual. A ripple of disbelief spread through the class, followed by a few tentative claps. The applause grew louder, filling the room as more students joined in. Jamal stood there, unsure of how to react. His cheeks burned, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something new, something unfamiliar. Pride. As the clapping subsided, Mrs. Thompson addressed the class. "What you just saw wasn't luck," she said, gesturing toward the board. "This is what happens when someone takes the time to understand the material. Jamal didn't just solve this problem, he broke it down, piece by piece, and made it look easy. That's real understanding." Her words hung in the air, and for once, Jamal didn't feel the urge to shrink back into his seat. Instead, he stood a little taller, his hands loosely at his sides. "Jamal," Mrs. Thompson continued, her tone softer now, "why haven't you spoken up before? If you can do this, why do you sit in the back and stay so quiet?" Jamal hesitated, glancing down at his sneakers. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he put into words the fear of standing out, the comfort of staying invisible? After a moment, he shrugged. "I didn't think anyone noticed," he said quietly. Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. "Well," she said, "it's time for that to change." The applause still lingered in Jamal's ears as he returned to his seat. The weight of the moment settled over him like a warm blanket. His classmates, still reeling from what they had witnessed, exchanged hushed whispers and occasional glances in his direction. Jamal felt their eyes on him, but this time, they weren't filled with ridicule or indifference. They were wide with curiosity and respect. Mrs. Thompson remained at the front of the room, her hands clasped together as if in deep thought. She wasn't a teacher who was easily impressed, but Jamal had done more than solve a difficult equation. He had upended her assumptions, not just about him, but about how she approached students like him, quiet, reserved, and often overlooked. "Class," she said, raising her voice to silence the murmurs, "what you just saw today is a reminder that everyone in this room has potential." Jamal proved that, and he didn't just solve a problem, he showed us what it looks like to approach something with clarity and focus. Jamal sat at his desk, still holding his notebook in his hands. His heart had finally slowed, but his thoughts raced. He hadn't planned for this. Solving equations in the margins of his notebook had always been a private escape, something he did for himself, not for recognition. Now for the first time, people were noticing him, and it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. A girl sitting a row ahead of him turned around, her eyes wide. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Jamal hesitated, unsure of what to say. I just figured it out," he said, his voice quiet. Another student chimed in. "That was insane. Are you like a genius or something?" Jamal's cheeks burned again, and he shook his head quickly. "No, I just like math." As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Mrs. Thompson called out, "Jamal, can you stay for a moment?" The class began to file out, but not before more students stopped to pat Jamal on the back or offer a quick, "That was awesome," as they passed. Jamal nodded awkwardly, clutching his notebook tighter. The attention was new, and while part of him wanted to retreat to his usual quiet corner, another part felt a flicker of pride. Once the room had emptied, Mrs. Thompson leaned against her desk, studying Jamal with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Jamal," she began, her tone softer than it had been earlier, "I owe you an apology." Jamal blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "An apology?" She nodded. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I like to think I know my students. But with you," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I misjudged you. I thought your quietness meant you weren't interested. I assumed your lack of participation meant you didn't care. Clearly, I was wrong." Jamal shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "It's okay," he mumbled. "No, it's not," Mrs. Thompson said firmly. "You have a gift, Jamal, and I don't want to see you hide it. Do you realize how rare it is for someone your age to solve a problem like that? To think the way you do?" Jamal looked down at his notebook, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn cover. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I just like doing it. It makes sense to me." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. "That's exactly what makes it special. You see things differently, and that's something to be proud of. But here's the thing. You can't keep it to yourself. There are programs, competitions, advanced courses that could help you grow, challenge you. I'd be happy to help you find them if you're interested." Jamal's heart raced at the thought. The idea of stepping into a world beyond the quiet comfort of his own learning was both thrilling and terrifying. He thought back to the moment at the board, how the equation had clicked into place, and how the room had felt different afterward. Could he do more? Could he be more? I, I don't know, he admitted. "What if I mess up?" Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. "Messing up is part of learning, but if you don't try, you'll never know what you're capable of." That night, Jamal sat at the small kitchen table in his family's modest home, his notebook open in front of him. His parents sat nearby, listening intently as he recounted what had happened that day. The equation, the applause, Mrs. Thompson's offer. His mother's eyes glistened with pride as she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Jamal, we've always known you were special," she said. "I'm so glad other people are starting to see it too." His father nodded, his deep voice steady. "This is just the beginning, son. Don't be afraid to show the world what you can do." Jamal spent the rest of the evening staring at the blank page of his notebook. For so long it had been a place for secrets, problems he solved for himself, notes he never shared. But now it felt like something more, a space for possibilities. He picked up his pencil and began to write, not just equations, but ideas, goals, dreams. For the first time, Jamal wasn't afraid of being seen. He was ready to step forward, to see where his talent could take him. The next day, the atmosphere in room 3002 was different. Jamal Carter, once the quiet kid who blended into the background, now found himself the center of attention. As he walked into the classroom, his classmates greeted him with nods, smiles, and even a few high fives. "Yo, Jamal!" a boy called out from the back of the room. "That was crazy yesterday. How'd you even do that?" Jamal hesitated. His usual instinct to shrink from attention battled with a new sense of pride. He felt it in his chest. "I just worked through it," he said modestly, sliding into his usual seat by the window. "That wasn't just working through it," another girl chimed in, leaning across her desk. "You made it look easy. You're like a math wizard or something." Jamal's cheeks flushed and he shrugged. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice soft but sincere. Even students who hadn't spoken to him before now seemed curious about him. A few asked if he could help them with their homework, and others just wanted to know more about what he was good at. For the first time, Jamal felt like he wasn't invisible. Mrs. Thompson entered the room, her usual brisk energy accompanying a glance toward Jamal that carried the trace of a smile. She began the lesson as usual, explaining the day's topic, but her tone was less sharp, her movements less rigid. When she called on Jamal to answer a question during the lesson, her voice was encouraging rather than critical. Jamal hesitated for a moment, but then answered confidently, his explanation clear and concise. The class murmured in quiet awe, and Mrs. Thompson nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent," she said, her voice warm. "That's the kind of thinking we need to see more of." After class, Mrs. Thompson asked Jamal to stay behind once more. This time the conversation wasn't about apologies. It was about opportunities. "Jamal," she began, sitting on the edge of her desk, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about yesterday. You have an incredible gift, and I don't want it to go to waste." Jamal looked down at his notebook, unsure of what to say. "I don't really know what to do with it," he admitted. "That's where I can help," Mrs. Thompson said. "There's an advanced math program at the district level, a class for students like you who need more of a challenge. It's after school, twice a week, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Jamal's eyes widened. The idea of joining an advanced class was exciting, but also intimidating. "Do you think I'd be good enough for that?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson smiled. I don't think you've already proven it. This is a chance for you to explore your potential and see how far you can go. I've already spoken to the program coordinator, and they're excited to have you. Jamal's mind raced. He thought about the problem on the board, the way the class had looked at him with admiration, and the pride in his parents' eyes when he told them what had happened. Slowly he nodded. Okay, he said, I'll do it. The following week, Jamal attended his first advanced math class. Walking into the room, he felt the same nervous anticipation that he had felt standing in front of the whiteboard. The other students, some from different schools, were chatting in small groups, their energy vibrant and competitive. As the instructor began the lesson, Jamal quickly realized he was in the right place. The problems were challenging, the pace fast, and the discussions lively. For the first time, he felt surrounded by peers who shared his love for numbers, and it was exhilarating. Back at Riverside Middle, Jamal's reputation as the math kid grew. His classmates began seeking him out for help, not just in math but also as someone they respected. The boy who had once felt invisible was now an integral part of the class, his quiet brilliance inspiring others. Mrs. Thompson, too, found herself viewing her students differently. Jamal's transformation had reminded her of the importance of looking beyond surface behavior, of finding the hidden potential in every student. She made it a point to engage with her quieter students, encouraging them to step forward in their own ways. One evening, as Jamal sat at the kitchen table working on a particularly tricky problem for his advanced class, his mother walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm so proud of you, Jamal, she said. You've always been special, but now the world is starting to see it too. Jamal looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. Thanks, Mom, he said, glancing back at his notebook. He paused for a moment, his pencil hovering over the page. For the first time, he wasn't just solving a problem for himself. He was building a future, one equation, one opportunity, one step at a time. As he wrote the next line of his solution, Jamal felt a quiet certainty settle over him. He didn't know exactly where his path would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to follow it. And in that moment, the boy who had once hidden his brilliance knew he was ready to shine.